England's break with Rome did not begin as a revolution. It began as a dynastic emergency, argued through canon law, sharpened by European power politics, and haunted by a memory no Tudor ruler could escape. When succession failed, England bled. That is the central paradox of Henry VIII's reign. A marital dispute became a constitutional earthquake. A question of inheritance became a war over jurisdiction. A king's fear of dying without a male heir became the legal foundation for royal supremacy over the church in England. The familiar version is too small. It reduces the crisis to appetite. Henry the tyrant, Henry the lover, Henry the husband who discarded wives in pursuit of desire. Desire mattered, personality mattered, Anne Boleyn mattered, Catherine of Aragon mattered. But beneath the scandal operated a colder and more consequential machine. Henry's so-called great matter was not merely romance, lust, or theology. It was a succession problem inside a monarchy still haunted by civil war. A dynasty young enough to remember that a disputed crown could turn noble houses into armies and family trees into battle maps. It was not a love story, but a sovereignty crisis. The deeper question is not simply why Henry wanted an annulment. The deeper question is how one king's need for a male heir became the legal architecture for separating England from papal authority. How did a problem of marriage become a doctrine of state power? How did private anxiety become public law? How did the search for a son help create a new theory of where ultimate authority lived? This is the chessboard. Rome stood at the center of the old religious order, claiming jurisdiction over souls, marriages, dispensations, appeals, and the conscience of Christendom. The Habsburg Empire, under Charles V, exerted a gravitational force across Europe, military, dynastic, and diplomatic. France watched for advantage, eager to weaken Habsburg influence and exploit English uncertainty. Parliament, long a body of statute and petition, waited to become something more dangerous, the legal engine through which revolution could wear the clothing of obedience. The English nobility calculated survival. The clergy balanced two masters, Rome and the crown. And above them all stood the fragile Tudor dynasty, founded after Bosworth Field in 1485 AD, legitimacy conscious, anxious, and painfully aware that kingship was never only ceremony. Kingship was inheritance, recognition, bloodline, law, and force. Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509 AD with brilliance and expectations surrounding him. He was learned, pious, theatrical, physically commanding, and hungry for glory. Yet he inherited more than a kingdom. He inherited a regime still trying to prove that the Wars of the Roses were truly over. The Tudors had ended one cycle of dynastic violence, but they had not erased the political memory that made uncertain succession feel like an invitation to collapse. In that world, a son was not simply a child. A son was a peace treaty with the future. Then Europe closed around him. In 1527 AD, the sack of Rome shattered the illusion that the papacy floated above worldly coercion. Imperial troops operating in the political universe of Charles V devastated the Eternal City, and Pope Clement VII emerged spiritually exalted but strategically cornered. That mattered because Charles V was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. Henry's annulment request was not a tidy legal petition resting on a papal desk. It was an insult wrapped in canon law, striking directly at the honor of the most powerful dynasty in Europe. From that trap came a radical possibility. If Rome controlled the answer, England might change the authority allowed to answer. In 1533 AD, the Act in Restraint of Appeals would declare that England possessed imperial jurisdiction within itself, cutting off appeals to Rome. In 1534 AD, the Act of Supremacy would proclaim Henry supreme head of the Church of England. These were not minor administrative adjustments. They were claims about the location of final authority. Here at Archives of Humanity, Professor Adrian Lockwell examines the machinery of power, not court gossip. Henry's marriages are famous. The deeper drama is how fear, law, theology, and ambition converged to rewire a kingdom. To understand why that happened, the investigation must begin where Henry's own fears began. With a dynasty terrified of succession, a Europe balanced on the edge of coercion, and a Rome that could not simply grant what the English king demanded. Beneath the ceremonies of Tudor kingship lay the wound that governed the dynasty: political memory. England had not forgotten what a disputed succession could unleash. For much of the 15th century AD, the Wars of the Roses had turned the rival claims of Lancaster and York into a national catastrophe. Bloodline became battle plan. Noble households became armed camps. Legal arguments over inheritance became executions, betrayals, confiscations, and battlefield deaths. This was the lesson burned into the ruling class. When dynastic legitimacy becomes uncertain, the crown stops being a symbol of order and becomes the prize in a civil war. Henry VII understood that lesson with unusual clarity. His victory at Bosworth Field in 1485 AD did more than defeat Richard III. It created a new regime. Yet the Tudor dynasty was not ancient, inevitable, or universally secure. It was young, anxious, and legitimacy-conscious from its first breath. Henry VII possessed Lancastrian blood, but his claim was not beyond challenge. His marriage to Elizabeth of York was a strategic act of national repair, a symbolic stitching together of the houses that had torn England apart. But symbols do not erase political memory. They manage it, they calm it, they do not destroy it. So Tudor kingship developed under pressure. It had to appear older than it was. It had to persuade nobles, clergy, foreign courts, and the English political nation that the age of faction had ended. In that world, a king without a secure line of succession was not merely unfortunate. He was a potential doorway back into chaos. When Henry VIII inherited the throne in 1509 AD, he inherited not only a crown, but an expectation that the Tudor experiment would finally become permanent. He was young, educated, physically impressive, and eager for martial glory. England projected onto him the dream of restored royal majesty, a confident monarchy after decades of dynastic fear. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon appeared to strengthen that dream. Catherine was not an ornamental queen or a passive obstacle in a male drama. She was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, trained in the severe world of Iberian monarchy, Catholic piety, diplomacy, and dynastic calculation. She brought with her the prestige of Spain and the authority of a woman raised among rulers. But that marriage contained a legal complication that would later detonate. Catherine had first been married to Henry's elder brother, Arthur, who died in 1502 AD. To marry Henry afterward required papal permission, because canon law treated marriage to a brother's widow as a prohibited degree of affinity. Pope Julius II granted the dispensation, but its moral and legal strength depended on a crucial question. Had Catherine's marriage to Arthur been consummated? Catherine insisted, consistently and with formidable moral courage, that it had not. Her marriage to Henry, she maintained, was valid before God, law, and conscience. For a time, the danger remained hidden beneath ceremony and hope. Then the royal nursery became a chamber of state anxiety. Catherine gave birth to Mary in 1516 AD, a legitimate daughter of royal blood. But no surviving son followed. In another dynasty, this might have been manageable. In Tudor political psychology, it was alarming. A female heir was possible, but possibility is not the same as confidence. England remembered the 12th century AD conflict between Matilda and Stephen, when a contested succession helped plunge the realm into prolonged disorder. More recently, the Wars of the Roses had taught every ambitious noble that uncertainty invited faction. A daughter might inherit in principle. In practice, the political class would ask who would marry her, who would govern through her, which faction would control access to her, and whether rival claimants might emerge from the shadows of old bloodlines. The body of the queen had become the battlefield of the state. This is why Henry cannot be reduced to impatience, vanity, or desire. Those forces mattered, because power magnifies every human appetite. But Henry interpreted reproductive failure through a more explosive triangle: providence, law, and political survival. If God had denied him a son, perhaps the marriage itself was cursed. If the marriage was cursed, perhaps the papal dispensation had never possessed true authority. If the dispensation was invalid, then the succession crisis was not private grief. It was a constitutional emergency. Here scripture became strategy. Henry looked to Leviticus, where taking a brother's wife was associated with childlessness, and he read the absence of a surviving son as divine evidence. Catherine's defenders could answer with Deuteronomy, where levirate obligation could require a man to marry his brother's widow in order to preserve a family line. The dispute was not a simple contest between lust and religion. It was a legal theological battlefield, where inheritance, salvation, royal authority, and national survival converged. The tragedy lay in the collision of certainties. Henry believed a male heir was necessary to silence the ghosts of civil war. Catherine believed that fear could not invalidate a lawful marriage or destroy Mary's legitimacy. Both stood inside the same haunted kingdom, but each drew a different command from its past. And once Henry concluded that England's survival required an answer, the deeper question emerged: who had the authority to give it? The king could command nobles, pressure clergy, summon councils, and dominate court politics. But the annulment still pointed beyond England, toward Rome, into a Europe where family honor, imperial power, canon law, and papal survival were already locked in a far larger struggle. The Tudor succession crisis did not remain sealed inside England's borders. It crossed the Channel and entered a Europe already strained by rivalry, debt, faith, and imperial ambition. Catherine of Aragon was not merely Henry's wife, and not merely England's queen. She was a Spanish princess, a daughter of the Catholic monarchs, and the aunt of Charles V, the most powerful ruler in Christendom. Her marriage was therefore not a private arrangement. It was a diplomatic bridge into the Habsburg world. By the 1520s AD, Europe was not a harmonious republic of Christian princes calmly awaiting papal judgment. It was a battlefield disguised as a diplomatic order. To the west stood Valois France under Francis I, proud, wounded, and determined to resist Habsburg encirclement. Across the continent stretched the vast inheritance of Charles V. Spain, the Low Countries, Habsburg lands in Central Europe, imperial authority in Germany, and decisive interests in Italy. Between these armed giants stood the papacy under Clement VII, formerly the spiritual summit of Western Christendom, yet forced in practice to maneuver like an Italian state fighting for survival. England wanted relevance on this grand chessboard. Henry VIII sought the prestige of a king who could shape the balance of Europe, not merely react to it. But England was not France, and it was not the Habsburg Empire. Its influence depended on agility, marriage alliances, subsidies, treaties, and the careful timing of royal favor. Henry's request for an annulment, therefore, did not enter a neutral court of law. It entered a continental trap. The central fact was brutal in its simplicity. Charles V was Catherine's nephew. To declare Catherine's marriage invalid was to do more than answer Henry's succession crisis. It was to dishonor the emperor's aunt, weaken the legitimacy of Princess Mary, and imply that a Habsburg marriage had rested on a defective papal dispensation. In dynastic politics, family dignity was not decoration. It was capital. It was reputation. It was leverage. An insult to Catherine could become an insult to Charles, and an insult to Charles could become a European crisis. Then came the catastrophe that transformed pressure into paralysis. The sack of Rome in 1527 AD. Imperial troops, many unpaid and mutinous, descended on the city and humiliated the symbolic heart of Latin Christendom. Pope Clement VII was trapped, coerced, and forced to absorb a lesson no theology could erase. Armies could dictate the atmosphere in which spiritual judgments were made. Clement was not simply weak. That explanation is too easy. He was strategically constrained. He had to preserve papal authority while surviving the political reality created by Charles V's dominance in Italy. If he granted Henry's annulment, he risked enraging the emperor whose shadow now fell across the papal world. If he denied Henry outright, he risked driving a proud and volatile English king toward defiance. Delay became a tactic of survival. It kept every door technically open while the walls quietly closed in. Here, the paradox of medieval Christendom stood exposed. The papacy claimed universal spiritual jurisdiction, but it did not float above earthly power. It owned lands, needed allies, feared armies, negotiated debts, and survived among princes who spoke in the grammar of force. Sacred institutions were not immune to geopolitical gravity. In Henry's crisis, spiritual authority had become hostage to imperial arithmetic. The irony was severe because Henry had not begun as Rome's enemy. In 1521 AD, Pope Leo X granted him the title Defender of the Faith for his attack on Martin Luther's theology. Henry had presented himself as a champion of Catholic orthodoxy, a learned king defending the old order against reformist rebellion. Yet within a decade, that same king would begin to view Rome not as the guardian of truth, but as the obstacle to survival. That is why the English break cannot be reduced to Protestantism alone. Lutheran ideas mattered, reformist networks mattered, and Boleyn's circle would matter. But the first engine of rupture was jurisdictional and dynastic. The immediate question was not whether England would become Protestant. The question was whether final authority over an English king's marriage belonged to Rome, or could be relocated inside the realm itself. The annulment case became a pressure chamber. Theology, bloodline, imperial prestige, papal survival, and the psychology of a king who increasingly equated delay with betrayal. The old order still possessed immense authority, but that authority was entangled in the politics it claimed to judge. And once Henry grasped that ordinary channels might never deliver the answer he wanted, attention shifted to the figures who would try to solve, exploit, resist, or weaponize the crisis. Catherine and Wolsey, Cromwell, More, and Cranmer. Around them, marriage was ceasing to be only a sacrament. It was becoming a test of sovereignty. Within that diplomatic trap, the crisis acquired its human command structure. Not caricatures, not cardboard villains, not romance figures pushed across a painted court. These were strategic minds and moral agents, each carrying a private calculation into a public emergency. In a world where marriage was diplomacy, theology was law, and legitimacy could decide whether a kingdom slept or burned. At the center stood Henry VIII, still too often reduced to appetite. That reduction is convenient, but historically lazy. Henry was charismatic, intellectually serious, theologically engaged, and intensely conscious of royal majesty. He read, argued, performed kingship, hunted glory, and believed monarchy was not merely an office, but a sacred burden. Yet beneath the splendor ran a volatile current. As the annulment stalled, Henry's conviction hardened. Obedience to the king was not administrative preference. It was the grammar of order itself. To resist him was not merely to disagree. It was to endanger the architecture of the realm. Opposite him stood Catherine of Aragon, and the myth of the helpless, discarded wife collapses under the weight of the evidence. Catherine was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, trained in the hard political culture of Iberian monarchy, where crusade, dynastic strategy, law, and statecraft were fused into one imperial discipline. She had served as regent in England. She understood diplomacy. She understood public dignity. And she understood that her marriage was not only a sacrament or a personal bond. It was the shield around Mary's legitimacy. If Catherine yielded, Mary's claim could be degraded. If Mary's claim was degraded, Catherine's life became a political fiction. Her resistance was pious, but it was also strategic. She fought with memory, law, and moral authority. Then came Anne Boleyn, perhaps the most distorted figure on the board, and was not merely the seductress of hostile propaganda, nor simply the romantic heroine of later imagination. She was a court operator of unusual intelligence, polished by continental experience and touched by reformist currents moving through France and the Low Countries. Her refusal to become Henry's conventional mistress was not a flirtation stretched into policy. It was leverage. She understood the court's brutal arithmetic. Proximity without status could destroy a woman. Queenship was protection, prize, and peril at once. Delay made her position more dangerous, because her influence rested on a promise still suspended in air, that she would become queen, and that through her the Tudor future would be remade. Around these three moved the ministers, scholars, and guardians of order. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey had built his greatness on royal service. He was Henry's chief architect of diplomacy, a prince of the church who understood Europe as a system of alliances, ceremonies, pressure, money, and prestige. But Wolsey's power depended on delivery. In a court governed by royal favor, failure was not merely disappointment. It was political extinction waiting for a legal form. Thomas More represented a different force. Humanist, lawyer, statesman, and servant of order, More was no revolutionary of private conscience against all authority. He valued hierarchy, stability, and the unity of Christendom. But he also believed that jurisdiction had sacred limits. His tragedy would emerge from the collision between loyalty and conscience. He could serve the king in many matters, but not if service required declaring that the crown possessed final authority over the church in the form Henry demanded. Thomas Cranmer stood near the intellectual machinery of the solution. A theologian rather than a street conspirator, Cranmer mattered because he could give Henry's cause a legal theological route. If the marriage to Catherine could be judged invalid inside England, then the king's problem could escape Rome's delays. Cranmer's future importance lay in a brutal truth about revolutions. Force alone is rarely enough. Power seeks arguments that make its decisions appear lawful. And then there was Thomas Cromwell, not a modern secular bureaucrat misplaced in the 16th century, but a man operating inside a deeply religious world while seeing institutional power with extraordinary clarity. Cromwell's genius was not that he dismissed belief. It was that he understood how belief, revenue, statute, archives, courts, intimidation, and administration could be assembled into a machine. Where Wolsey negotiated, Cromwell redesigned. Where others saw a blocked petition, Cromwell saw the deeper move, changed the jurisdiction in which the question could be answered. The wider board mattered just as much. The English clergy, pressured through premunire charges for recognizing foreign authority against the king's realm, began to discover that survival might require submission. Parliament was not a simple decorative stamp. It became the legitimating engine through which upheaval could wear the clothing of law. Universities and scholars were recruited to manufacture learned opinion, turning academic theology into political ammunition. Court faction hardened. Boleyn allies, conservative nobles, reform-minded clergy, and old-guard Catholic loyalists maneuvered in the narrowing space between royal desire and institutional collapse. No single villain controlled the drama. No single hero could redeem it. Ambition, conscience, fear, law, faction, legitimacy, and survival were now moving together. The question was no longer merely whether Henry's marriage was valid. The deeper question was who possessed the authority to decide. And before Cromwell's revolution could be born in statute, the old system would receive one last chance to answer in the courtroom theater of the king's great matter. The first strategy was not revolution. It was procedure. Henry VIII did not begin by smashing the old order. He began by trying to win inside it. The king's case, soon known across Europe as the Great Matter, was not presented as a simple divorce. It was framed as an annulment, a declaration that the marriage had never been valid under divine law. That distinction was not technical ornament. It was the entire battlefield. Divorce implied that a real bond was being broken. Annulment implied that a false bond was being uncovered. Henry's argument rested on a dangerous fusion of scripture, fear, and dynastic necessity. Catherine of Aragon had first been married to his elder brother, Arthur, who died in 1502 AD. If that earlier marriage had been consummated, then Henry could read his own marriage through the warning of Leviticus, a man taking his brother's wife and being left childless. In Henry's mind, the absence of a surviving son ceased to be only a private grief. It became evidence. Providence seemed to speak through the nursery. Law seemed to speak through scripture. Political memory, still haunted by civil war, turned reproductive failure into a national emergency. But Catherine's defense was not weakness dressed as piety. It was a sophisticated legal and moral counteroffensive. She insisted that her marriage to Arthur had not been consummated, and therefore that no forbidden union had existed. Her marriage to Henry, she argued, was lawful, public, sacred, and confirmed by years of queenship. She had borne Mary in 1516 AD, and Mary's legitimacy depended upon Catherine's own. To yield was not merely to lose a husband. It was to surrender a daughter's future, a queen's honor, and the authority of the church that had sanctioned the union. At the center of the dispute stood the papal dispensation issued by Julius II. Here the great matter sharpened into a constitutional riddle disguised as a marriage case. Could a pope dispense with the impediment that allowed Henry to marry his brother's widow? If the barrier belonged only to ecclesiastical law, papal authority might remove it. If it belonged to divine law, no pope could lawfully undo it. Beneath the marriage question lay the deeper problem. Where did final authority reside when scripture, papal jurisdiction, royal survival, and dynastic legitimacy contradicted one another? Cardinal Thomas Wolsey tried to solve the crisis with the machinery he understood best: ecclesiastical diplomacy, pressure, learned argument, and delay managed as statecraft. For years, Wolsey had been the great engine of Henrician government, the man who translated royal desire into policy. But the great matter exposed the fatal weakness of a minister whose power depended on delivering results no system was willing to provide. Rome could not treat the case as an isolated legal petition. Catherine was the aunt of Emperor Charles V. After the sack of Rome in 1527 AD, Pope Clement VII operated under the shadow of imperial power. To grant Henry's annulment was to insult Charles. To deny Henry openly was to risk English defiance. The papacy did not merely judge, it calculated survival. Spiritual authority was being pulled through the machinery of European power. The apparent solution came through the Legadan Court at Blackfriars in 1529 AD, presided over by Cardinal Campeggio and Wolsey. It was supposed to provide Henry with a lawful arena in which his case could advance. Instead, it became a theater of postponement. Courts can speak in the language of procedure while history hears the language of power. Every delay carried the weight of Habsburg pressure. Every adjournment deepened Henry's suspicion that justice had been captured by politics. Then Catherine made her decisive move. She appealed to Rome. It was strategically brilliant. By appealing beyond the English court, she moved judgment away from Henry's immediate pressure and into the papal system most constrained by Charles V. Catherine understood what rulers and ministers understood. Law is not only argument, it is jurisdiction. Whoever controls the form controls the tempo. Whoever controls the tempo can exhaust an opponent. For Henry, delay became intolerable. The succession crisis did not feel like a matter that could wait upon Roman calendars. Anne Boleyn's position at court depended on queenship, not indefinite expectation. Mary's status, Catherine's resistance, and the absence of a male heir pressed against the king's imagination. Delay became humiliation. Humiliation became rage. Rage began searching for theory. Wolsey paid first. His failure to secure the annulment destroyed him. In 1529 AD, he fell from power, stripped of authority by the monarch whose ambitions he had served. The old cardinal, once the architect of England's diplomatic reach, became the visible ruin of a strategy that had failed inside the old order. He died in 1530 AD before trial, his career collapsing at the exact point where traditional authority failed to satisfy royal will. This was Henry VIII's crucial education. Canon law had been invoked. Papal authority had been petitioned. Scholars had argued. Cardinals had maneuvered. A court had convened. And still the answer Henry believed necessary did not arrive. Here history turns not with a battle cry, but with a bureaucratic conclusion. When an institution cannot produce the outcome a ruler believes survival demands, the ruler may stop asking that institution for permission. He may begin asking why that institution has the power to answer at all. Wolsey's fall cleared the ground for a different kind of mind. Not the prince of church diplomacy, but the architect of legal transformation. Thomas Cromwell would not merely try to win Henry's case before Rome. He would begin to redefine the realm in which the case could be judged. Wolsey had tried to win the king's freedom inside the old architecture. Cromwell's genius was colder, sharper, and more revolutionary. He stopped treating Rome as the court of final appeal. If Rome controlled the answer, then the question itself had to be moved into another jurisdiction. That was the pivot. Not, at first, a clean Protestant conversion. Not a sudden eruption of pure theology. It was a migration of authority engineered through law. Thomas Cromwell understood that power is not only the army that enforces a command. Power is the map that decides where a command may be judged. For years, Henry VIII had asked whether his marriage to Catherine of Aragon could be annulled. Cromwell changed the deeper question. Who had the right to decide? The instrument was Parliament. The Reformation Parliament, first summoned in 1529 AD, became the engine room of a constitutional revolution. It did not resemble a battlefield, but it achieved what armies often seek. It altered sovereignty. Bill by bill, pressure by pressure, the English church was forced to discover that its old loyalties, to canon law, to clerical privilege, to Rome, now stood beneath the shadow of the crown. The first weapon was fear dressed as legality. Charges of praemunire were used against the clergy, accusing them of recognizing a foreign jurisdiction contrary to royal authority. This was not decorative legal theater. It warned bishops, abbots, and church courts that their entire institutional world could be treated as a treasonous inheritance from another age. The clergy had lived beneath a double sky, king and pope. Cromwell began collapsing that sky into one. Then came the submission of the clergy in 1532 AD. This was a decisive humiliation. The clergy agreed not to create new ecclesiastical laws without royal license, and existing church legislation could be reviewed under royal authority. In practical terms, the independent lawmaking power of the English church was being chained to the throne. The crown was no longer asking the church to cooperate. It was asserting command over the church's machinery. In the same year, 1532 AD, the Act in Restraint of Annates struck at the money. Annates were payments made to Rome by newly appointed bishops. This was not a minor accounting dispute. Sovereignty has a bloodstream, and that bloodstream is revenue. By restricting the financial flow from England to the papacy, Cromwell revealed a brutal principle. Jurisdiction and money are inseparable. A power that collects, approves, appoints, and profits is never merely spiritual. It is political. Then, in 1533 AD, came the masterstroke, the Act in Restraint of Appeals. Its language was explosive. It declared that this realm of England is an empire. Not an empire in the later sense of overseas dominion, but in the older legal sense, complete within itself, owing no external superior in matters of jurisdiction. The phrase was a constitutional blade. It cut the road from England to Rome. No more appeals beyond the realm. No more Catherine carrying her case into the papal system. No more waiting for Clement VII, trapped beneath Habsburg pressure. The marriage question could now be concluded inside England, by English authority, under the king's supremacy. Law had not merely regulated power. Law had manufactured a new reality. Into this redesigned world stepped Thomas Cranmer. Made Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533 AD, Cranmer supplied the necessary ecclesiastical judgment. Henry's marriage to Catherine was declared invalid. His marriage to Anne Boleyn was declared valid. The old petition had become a domestic verdict, and was crowned queen in 1533 AD. The revolution now had a living symbol. A new queen, a new jurisdiction, a new future promised by statute and ceremony. But history has a merciless instinct for irony. In September 1533 AD, and gave birth not to the long-awaited prince, but to Elizabeth, a daughter, brilliant in retrospect, devastating in the immediate politics of Tudor succession. The legal earthquake had not yet solved the fear that caused it, so the crown pressed further. In 1534 AD, the Act of Supremacy declared Henry VIII supreme head of the Church of England. The phrase transformed royal authority from pressure into doctrine. The king was no longer merely defending English rights against Rome. He was now the supreme earthly head of the church within his realm. Medieval universality had been broken by national jurisdiction. But every revolution in authority faces the same severe problem. Declaration is not obedience. A statute may define reality, but people must be compelled to inhabit it. That is why the Treasons Act of 1534 AD mattered so profoundly. It gave the new order teeth. To deny royal supremacy could become not merely disagreement, not merely dissent, but treason. Words became dangerous. Silence could become suspicious. Conscience was being pulled into the courtroom of the state. Here lies Cromwell's terrible brilliance. He did not simply help Henry obtain an annulment. He built a mechanism by which royal will could travel through Parliament, bind the clergy, sever Rome, redirect money, settle succession, and punish resistance. The monarchy had learned to weaponize law as architecture, and once sovereignty had been declared, the next question became unavoidable. Who would bend, who would speak, and who would pay the price for refusing? Law had declared the revolution. Now the revolution demanded witnesses. A statute could sit on parchment like a locked weapon, impressive, solemn, and useless until men and women were made to live inside it. Henry's supremacy over the church, proclaimed through Parliament in 1534 AD, did not become real merely because the ink dried. It had to pass into courtrooms, pulpits, colleges, monasteries, noble households, and above all, into speech. The new state required more than obedience. It required audible agreement. That is why the oath became the central ritual of the new order. The oath to the succession, and then the oath bound to royal supremacy, turned politics into confession. It was no longer enough to avoid rebellion, pay taxes, and keep the peace. Among elites, clergy, lawyers, scholars, and office holders, loyalty had to be translated into words. The crown understood a severe truth of power. Spoken assent changes the moral architecture of a regime. Once a person swears publicly, that person is no longer merely governed by the system. He becomes implicated in it. Here the English Reformation moved from jurisdiction into psychology. The king's inward conviction that his marriage to Catherine had been unlawful, that Anne's queenship was legitimate, that Rome possessed no final authority in England, became the realm's outward law. And when law claims supremacy over conscience, silence becomes politically unstable. Refusal is no longer a private reservation. It becomes a signal. Thomas More stood at precisely this fatal intersection. He was not a conventional rebel. He raised no army. He plotted no invasion. He had been a lawyer, a humanist, Lord Chancellor, and servant of public order. Yet his conscience could not accept the oath in the form demanded by the crown. More's crisis was not merely about Anne Boleyn, nor even about succession alone. It was about jurisdiction. If the king could compel public assent to royal supremacy over the church, then the ancient structure of Christendom had been overturned by statute, and conscience was being ordered to ratify the change. Bishop John Fisher reached the same frontier from another path. Learned, austere, and uncompromising, Fisher had defended Catherine of Aragon and resisted the royal supremacy with a clarity that made him dangerous. He became a symbol of Catholic opposition, not because he commanded soldiers, but because he represented an older claim that ultimate spiritual authority could not simply be relocated by political necessity. The regime could not tolerate such symbols. In 1535 AD, Fisher was executed. That same year, Thomas More followed him to death. Their executions announced that the new sovereignty recognized no rival source of ultimate authority. Not Rome, not clerical tradition, not a private conscience that refused public submission. The question was not whether these men could be ignored. It was whether a revolutionary monarchy could survive prestigious dissent. And the pressure moved far beyond famous men. The Carthusian monks, among the most rigorous religious communities in England, also resisted the oath. Their refusal revealed that this was not simply a quarrel among courtiers and bishops. The crown's demand reached into enclosed religious life, into communities once imagined as distant from dynastic politics. Other dissenters suffered as well, not because each posed a military threat, but because revolutions fear alternative loyalties. A monk who would not swear could become more dangerous than a soldier, because he exposed the limit of command. This was fear as a governing technology. Not random terror, not merely anger. A system. Oaths created records. Statutes defined forbidden speech. Investigations identified hesitation. Denunciations made private conversation politically radioactive. Exemplary punishment taught the kingdom how to interpret survival. Cromwell's administrative network gathered information, monitored clerical compliance, pressed local authorities, and transformed the king's will into procedure. It was bureaucracy with a theological pulse. Paperwork carrying the weight of salvation and treason. The brilliance and the menace of Cromwell's system lay in its intimacy. It did not only command bodies, tested interiors. What did a bishop believe? What would a monk say under questioning? Would a nobleman affirm the legitimacy of Anne's children? Would a scholar concede that England possessed final jurisdiction within itself? The battlefield became the conscience, and the weapon was the legally compelled word. Yet the original wound remained open. Anne Boleyn had been crowned in 1533 AD, and Elizabeth had been born that same year. But Elizabeth was not the son Henry believed England required. The dynastic anxiety that had detonated the break with Rome still lived at the center of the regime. Royal supremacy had been proclaimed. Opponents had been crushed. But the male heir, the promised answer to civil war, faction, and uncertainty, had not arrived. So the state grew more severe because its victory was incomplete. A revolution born from insecurity often becomes most dangerous after its first triumph, when it has enough power to punish enemies but not enough certainty to feel safe. Having compelled persons to swear, the crown would next turn toward institutions too wealthy, too independent, and too symbolically tied to the old sacred order. The conscience had been tested. Now the stones, lands, and treasures of England's monasteries would be counted. Personal coercion had revealed one face of royal supremacy. Institutional seizure revealed another. After oaths, trials, and executions, the revolution moved from conscience to property, from spoken loyalty to the deep economic skeleton of medieval England. For centuries, the monasteries had been far more than houses of prayer. But these institutions were not untouched sanctuaries outside human weakness. Some were devout and disciplined. Others were wealthy, complacent, politically exposed, or vulnerable to accusations of decay. The truth was neither the Protestant caricature of universal corruption nor the nostalgic fantasy of universal holiness. Monasteries were mixed human institutions, charitable and self-interested, sacred and worldly, beloved and resented. That complexity did not protect them. It made them easier to dismantle. In 1535 AD, the crown ordered the Valor Ecclesiasticus, a vast survey of church wealth. Officially, it was an assessment. Strategically, it was reconnaissance. Cromwell's England was mastering a hard principle of state power. Authority does not merely command. It counts. It measures income, records land, identifies obligation, maps dependency, and converts information into leverage. Before confiscation could become policy, the crown needed to know what existed, who held it, and how much it was worth. The same machinery extended into inspection. Cromwell's visitors entered religious houses to investigate discipline, finances, relics, morality, and obedience. Some reports uncovered real abuses. Others reflected expectation, pressure, and the needs of a regime that had already marked the old order as expendable. Investigation became moral theater and administrative weapon at the same time. The crown could speak the language of reform, but reform walked beside revenue. The sacred was being audited. Then came the seizure. In 1536 AD, the dissolution of the smaller monasteries began. Houses with limited income were targeted first and presented as weak, decayed, or unworthy of survival. But this was not mere pruning. It became uprooting. Larger houses followed through 1539 AD and 1540 AD, until the monastic presence that had shaped English Christianity for centuries was broken apart with astonishing speed. The crown acquired lands, buildings, plate, rents, livestock, and movable wealth. Yet Henry did not simply gather everything into royal vaults. Much of the land was sold or granted to nobles, gentry, officials, and local elites. This was the decisive political lock-in mechanism. Men who might have mourned the old religion now discovered that their fortunes were tied to its destruction. A dissolved monastery could, in theory, be restored. But land transferred to hundreds of ambitious families became a fortress of self-interest. Reversal would no longer be merely theological. It would threaten title deeds, marriages, inheritances, and the rising class of beneficiaries who had purchased a stake in revolution. Here lay Cromwell's brutal genius. A jurisdictional break from Rome became a social transformation. Royal supremacy was no longer only an oath on parchment. It had landlords now. It had heirs. But societies do not surrender sacred landscapes without resistance. In the north, where attachment to traditional religion remained strong and suspicion of southern ministers ran deep, anger erupted. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 AD became the largest rebellion of Henry's reign. His name mattered. This was framed not as ordinary disorder, but as a holy rising, a defense of the Commonwealth against religious destruction, economic disruption, and the hated force of Cromwellian change. Robert Aske, a lawyer and gentleman, emerged as a central figure. The rebels demanded restoration of religious houses, protection of traditional faith, and the removal of evil counselors around the king. That phrase was politically careful. It allowed rebellion to wear the mask of loyalty. The king remained good, the ministers were wicked, and the realm had to be cleansed. Henry understood the danger. A direct confrontation with a mass northern rising could be risky. So he negotiated. He promised consideration. He offered pardon. He waited. Then, once rebellion lost momentum, punishment returned with calculation. Leaders were arrested. Executions followed. Robert Aske was executed in 1537 AD. The crown had shown that it could bargain as strategy and punish as doctrine. The lesson was severe. Revolutions endure not only because people believe in them, but because enough people profit from them, fear them, or become trapped inside their consequences. The dissolution changed England economically, spiritually, and politically. It stripped institutions, redistributed wealth, weakened old communal structures, and made reunion with Rome far more dangerous, because reunion now implied dispossession. And still, beneath all this upheaval, the original wound remained open. England had been reprogrammed, the monasteries had fallen, the crown had grown richer, the old sacred order had been shattered. But Henry still lacked the one thing no statute, survey, oath, or confiscation could manufacture: dynastic certainty. After the monasteries were measured, seized, and redistributed, the story returns to the original wound: succession. Henry VIII had broken jurisdiction, coerced conscience, and reorganized wealth to solve a dynastic problem. Yet the deeper irony is that the problem did not disappear. It became more dangerous, because now every question of inheritance carried the weight of religion, law, and sovereignty. Anne Boleyn had helped pull England away from Rome's orbit, but she did not produce the son around whom Henry's political imagination revolved. Elizabeth was born in 1533 AD, a child who would later dominate the century, but who arrived in Tudor arithmetic as a failure of expectation. By 1536 AD, Anne's position had collapsed. Faction moved quickly. Conservative enemies, Boleyn rivals, and courtiers reading Henry's attraction to Jane Seymour understood that royal desire had again become a political signal. The charges against Anne, adultery, incest, and treason, were spectacular, useful, and historically contested. But Tudor power did not need accusation to satisfy future historians. It needed accusation to neutralize the present. Anne was executed in 1536 AD. Her marriage was invalidated. Elizabeth's legitimacy was clouded. The woman crowned as the future of the dynasty became a legal stain to be erased. Here lies one of history's colder laws. Institutions can consume the very people who help create them. Anne had been a catalyst, not the master of the force released around her. Then came Jane Seymour. In 1537 AD, she gave Henry what he had pursued through diplomacy, theology, statute, intimidation, and blood: a surviving male heir. Edward was born, and the court treated the event as providence. But even this victory carried the mark of tragedy. Jane died shortly after childbirth. Henry had a son, but not peace. Continuity, but not certainty. An heir, but not a settled kingdom. When Henry died in 1547 AD, Edward VI inherited not merely a throne, but a reprogrammed state. Royal supremacy existed. The monasteries were broken. Appeals to Rome had been severed. Yet Edward was a child, and government passed through regency regimes that drove England between 1547 AD and 1553 AD in a more explicitly Protestant direction. What began under Henry as a jurisdictional revolution, king or pope who held final authority, now deepened into doctrinal reconstruction. Prayer books, images, clerical marriage, and worship itself became instruments of national policy. Edward's reign revealed the danger inside Henry's achievement. Once the crown claimed command over the church, every successor inherited the power to redirect the nation's soul. Sovereignty had become a lever. Each monarch could pull it differently. Then Edward died in 1553 AD, and the succession crisis returned like a ghost refusing burial. Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, ruled from 1553 AD to 1558 AD. In her person, Henry's discarded past returned to the throne. The marriage he had denied, the mother he had set aside, and the Catholic order he had fractured. Mary attempted restoration: Catholic worship, papal reunion, and reversal of Protestant advance. Her reign proved a crucial point. Henry's break with Rome was not irreversible in belief. Many could still imagine England inside Latin Christendom. But property had transformed politics. Monastic lands had become estates. Confiscation had created beneficiaries. Theology had been fused to inheritance. A return to Rome threatened not only conscience, but titles, fortunes, and elite survival. Mary could restore obedience to Rome, but she could not easily restore the England that existed before the break. The past had become unrecoverable because too many powerful men now stood upon its ruins. Then came Elizabeth I in 1558 AD, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, once dismissed as a dynastic disappointment. Her reign, lasting until 1603 AD, produced the long settlement Henry never fully designed. Elizabeth stabilized a Protestant national church through royal supremacy, national jurisdiction, controlled compromise, and resistance to foreign ecclesiastical command. The daughter of the executed queen became the lasting beneficiary of the revolution her mother helped ignite. Henry sought a son to secure the Tudor future, yet his daughters carried the historical drama. Mary tried to reverse him. Elizabeth made the breach durable. Thus Henry achieved control but not clarity. He sought certainty and produced oscillation. Edward's Protestant acceleration, Mary's Catholic restoration, Elizabeth's national settlement. The succession became a living argument about legitimacy, religion, gender, and sovereignty. By the end of the Tudor sequence, England's relation to Europe had changed permanently. The Crown had asserted that national sovereignty could supersede transnational ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Rome could be honored, rejected, negotiated with, or denounced, but it could no longer assume uncontested command over the English realm. The king who wanted a male heir did not merely alter his family tree. He altered the operating logic of the state. A private fear, fused to monarchy and law, became a revolution that outlived every marriage, every scaffold, and every Tudor heartbeat. And so the Tudor wager reaches its final shape, not as romance, not as a clean theological awakening, not as the inevitable birth of English nationalism, but as something more dangerous and more recognizably human. Henry VIII's break with Rome emerged from a collision of dynastic fear, geopolitical constraint, institutional ambition, and personal will. A king wanted certainty in a world built from contingency. A monarchy haunted by civil war demanded an heir. A papacy trapped beneath imperial pressure delayed. A parliament discovered that revolution could be written in the language of statute. And a realm learned that sovereignty, once claimed, never remains an abstraction. It becomes an oath. It becomes property. It becomes punishment. It becomes memory. The verdict is stark. Henry did not merely change church policy. He altered the operating principle of the English state. England moved from papal jurisdiction to royal supremacy, from the older medieval dream of a universal Christian order toward the harder architecture of national sovereignty, from ecclesiastical autonomy into a world where crown, parliament, and law could remake sacred authority. The English Reformation began with a marriage case, but it ended by redrawing the map of obedience. And yet the triumph was never simple. Henry sought stability, but produced turbulence. He sought a secure dynasty, but his children inherited a kingdom throne between Protestant reform, Catholic restoration, and Elizabethan settlement. He sought obedience, but created martyrs, rebels, opportunists, reformers, informers, and landowners whose fortunes now depended on the survival of the new order. He sought a son, but history would remember his daughters as the sovereign architects of England's future. The king who tried to master time was mastered by the consequences of his own solution. This is the cold genius of the episode. When an old institution refuses permission, power may stop asking and begin redefining who has the right to answer. Henry's revolution was not simply the destruction of Rome's authority in England. It was the creation of a new answer to an ancient question. Where does final authority reside? In the Pope? In the king? In scripture? In conscience? In parliament? In the nation imagined as a self-contained empire? The terrifying beauty of Tudor politics is that all these answers were advanced in the language of necessity. Fear disguised itself as principle. Ambition borrowed the robes of survival. Law became not only a restraint upon power, but a furnace in which power manufactured a new reality. And conscience, quiet, interior, invisible, became dangerous precisely because the state demanded public agreement. The private soul became a public battlefield. The modern mirror is not that present societies are Tudor England. History is not a costume drama repeating itself with new names, but the structure of the problem remains familiar. States still quarrel over who has final authority. Courts, executives, constitutions, legislatures, international bodies, religious communities, popular mandates, emergency necessity. Institutions still discover that legitimacy is strongest when obedience appears voluntary. Leaders still turn fear into policy. Societies still learn that silence, speech, and loyalty can become political instruments. Henry VIII's great matter, therefore, belongs not only to the 16th century. It belongs to the long human struggle over authority itself. Every society builds sacred boundaries around what it considers ultimate: law, nation, faith, security, liberty, the will of the people. But when fear enters the chamber, those boundaries begin to move. What was once unthinkable becomes necessary. What was once illegal becomes law. What was once sacred becomes negotiable. That is the enduring paradox. Henry wanted a dynasty secured by obedience, but created a political and religious revolution that outlived his body, his marriages, and his intentions. He tried to solve a succession crisis. He helped create a sovereignty crisis. And in doing so, he exposed one of history's most unsettling truths. Power does not merely rule within institutions. Under pressure, power tries to decide which institutions deserve to exist. The legacy question is this: when a civilization permits power to rewrite the sacred in the name of survival, how can it know whether it has saved itself or merely taught its rulers that nothing is beyond reach? For the next chapter in the Machinery of Power, select the documentary appearing on the end screen and continue the series. To keep receiving grand historical exposition centered on strategy, institutions, and the human condition, subscribe to Archives of Humanity. And in the comments, answer this directly. Which force drove Henry's revolution most? Fear, faith, law, or ambition?